Welcome to A Little Bit Radical, a business podcast from Standing on Giants. I'm Rob, your host. Join me as I meet people and organisations who are doing things differently, challenging the status quo and, yes, might just be a little bit radical.
What if every job was part-time and flexible by default? I'm speaking to an agency founder today who has introduced a number of a little bit radical workplace policies, including this one. Nyree Ambarchian is co-founder of Jack and Grace, a B Corp communications agency specialising in using comms as a force for good. I'm looking forward to hearing about this little bit radical workplace. Nyree, welcome to the podcast.
Hello, thank you for having me.
So Nyree, if you are a little bit radical and you're on our podcast, so we know that you are, what in your early life set you up for that?
Weirdly, I think the answer to that question is rules and following lots of rules at school, and as you kind of move through education, and then at work there are, I think, even more rules, and there are the written down rules, and then there is the stuff that you sort of just inhale and it's around you and you breathe it in. So for example, there are the rules in your contract about when you start work and when you leave work. And then there are the actual expectations that you figure out by watching everybody around you, and you kind of watch and you absorb and you learn. So trying really, really hard to follow all of those rules, the sort of written ones and the unwritten ones. I think it goes in three phases, or it kind of went in three phases for me as I went through the world. So you start off and you're desperate to do well and follow all the rules. Like you want to figure out the rules and then you want to follow them and sort of fit in. You don't challenge the rules. You just kind of watch them. You watch and learn. And then you stop noticing the rules. I liken them to microplastics by this point. Like they're just living in us. They're in all of us. We're breathing them in. We stop noticing them. We become the rules. And you definitely don't challenge them then. And then I think something happens. And for me, it was becoming a parent. And suddenly you are just less able to follow the rules. And you try really hard to follow the rules. And you probably try quite a sad amount to follow the rules. And then you fail. And then eventually you realise that the rules are the problem. It's not you, it's the rules. I really love my job. I've worked in comms for 25 years and I still really love it. Like I've always wanted to work hard. But the rules of workplace were impossible for me. And so I think it was at that point that I became a little bit radical and decided to set up Jack and Grace to kind of challenge some of those rules around balancing kind of people, planet and profit rather than just profit, and also trying to unpick some of those rules that we don't see anymore and try and make work for more people. So weirdly, the answer is I think it was trying to follow the rules, which became my route to becoming a little bit radical.
How interesting. I love you referring to these kind of both written and unwritten rules as microplastics, because that's a real unseen kind of toxin I share, by the way, becoming a parent and then thinking, why am I doing this? There's loads more important things. But what specifically are you talking about there? What kinds of things do you see as that kind of toxic microplastic?
One that springs to mind is not being open about pay. So to the point where loads of people, like a staggering number, think it's illegal to talk about how much you earn with your colleagues.
People think it's illegal, really?
People think
they
it's
think it's like
illegal. There's
a
law.
an actual discretion.
Yeah, you'll get in trouble. So that one's really interesting. And obviously no company has written down, or most companies don't have written down, you cannot speak about your salary, but we've sort of breathed it in. And the other stuff that you soak up, so for example, in writing, companies say we're really committed to diversity, but the stuff you're breathing in is that there's no women in senior roles. So you can see with your actual eyes, and that's what you're kind of learning. But there are loads of examples. I don't know if you've ever had this experience in the kind of backstory of your career, but I worked for a company where they were big, and if you had a meeting and you booked the room, somebody would wheel in the tea and coffee on a little silver trolley. Did you ever have? Do you remember
No.
that? Does it still happen somewhere? And they'd leave this trolley with the tea and coffee and maybe biscuits if you were lucky. And then at the start of the meeting, somebody would pour the tea and the coffee. And if you were the only woman in the room, which I quite often was in my early career, there was no rule that said part of your job is to pour the tea and coffee, but everyone would just sort of look your way, like you sort of breathed in that was your job. And if you didn't, say you were feeling a little bit dissenting, somebody would get up and they would say the words which still physically make my skin crawl, "Shall I be mum?" And then they would pour the tea. Do you remember
I'll
that?
be mother.
I'll be mother. And it gives me such an ick now, like physically. But stuff like that, I think the problem with these rules is that we have all breathed them in and you do stop noticing them, and you have to actually put quite a lot of effort in to spot them and unpick them. But those are the kinds of things.
And then to challenge them becomes a bit of effort. I've got a story about the pay one. So my first job, I remember actually being called in by the head of HR to the meeting room in quite a serious, like, "Rob, could I have a word?" And then she essentially kind of chastised me for talking about pay because someone else had been, I think, in a meeting about his own development and then heard mentioned, "Oh, and you've got people like Rob on," I think it was 30 grand at the time. And this was so ridiculous for a number of reasons. I hadn't told this guy how much I was paid. That wasn't my salary. Which obviously the head of HR knew that wasn't my salary. So they then said, and he got it wrong. So I wasn't sure, but just to let you know, we take this really seriously talking about pay. And I'm like, cool, but I obviously haven't, have I? So,
But what
anyway.
if you had?
Well, yeah, exactly. The only reason to not talk about it is because then there's fewer difficult conversations about pay to have with people, right? It's kind of it's an effort save.
Yeah, and you can get away with depressing somebody's salary because, it's secret and we don't talk about it. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Generally in my life, I prefer radical transparency. And I think if you go in with that around pay, then it's just very simple. But it does mean that you need to have done more work to kind of define the framework and all of that stuff, don't you? You can't just sort of end up with this higgledy-piggledy pay structure. Anyway, really interesting. So that sounds to me like as a child, you didn't really feel that you were particularly radical because you were more of a rule follower. And it was, only later in life when you became a mum that you were really kind of energized. That seems to be very topical. I feel like the role of parents in the workforce has kind of never had more visibility, and the challenges that parents face in the workforce, and especially mothers, I think we have to say. Are you kind of energized by the debate, kind of getting more attention? Do you think things are improving? How far have we got to go? Tell us a bit about that.
I love that you think any new parent might be energized. That isn't at its finest.
That's the parent of a 4-year-old there. I'm just starting to get some energy back thing.
Yeah, you do. It comes back slowly, doesn't it? You're right. There is more talking about this than ever before, which I think is a good thing. Because if you're not talking about it, you can't even start to unpick it and challenge it. I am never sure how much of that is landing in a bit of a bubble. We are parents and we're probably more tuned into it. But I think you're right. There is more kind of discussion about it. But I don't think it's changing. It's changing, but it's snail's pace. It's so incredibly slow. And the same problems repeat themselves. When I talk about kind of my experience, it is not unique in any way. And people have been setting up their own companies, particularly mums have been setting up their own companies to make work for them for a very long time, and that has not stopped. The only option is to set something up of your own, which seems bonkers. So yes, we're talking about it more. It's noisier, but I don't know how much it's translating. It's moved on a bit. Like there's, I'm an optimist. Stuff's moved on a bit, but not enough.
interesting. I've interviewed George Gabriel, who's part of the dad shift around parental leave. It feels like there's some companies that offer really great parental leave. Obviously, most still don't, and the statutory is still not great. But then, even if you have great parental leave, that doesn't really cover what happens once you come back to work, right? So it's all very well giving someone generous time off to look after their newborn baby, but then around then what happens afterwards, and realizing that person can't just go back to the exact same structure, the exact same working hours, etc., etc. Let's move into your work now then, because you mentioned that, you know, your experience led you to set up your own thing. So that's a perfect opportunity. Tell us about how you came to found Jack and Grace. What was the thing that happened, by the way, and then how did you go about founding your own business?
So the thing that happened was the whole process of becoming a parent, trying to juggle quite a rigid workplace structure and expectations, all the rules, with going through pregnancy, having a child, and exactly as you say, the coming back bit and navigating that was really, really difficult.
And was this still like fixed office? You're in 5 days a week. You know, this is like pre-COVID time, I'm guessing.
It's pre-COVID time. So we set Jack and Grace up just before COVID started. So brilliant timing as always, like a challenge. And so all of this kind of happened pre-COVID, but it was that return to work bit that was just made impossible. And that's when the sort of failure hit, because you just can't. Yeah, it's really difficult to juggle the timings of the kind of infrastructure of childcare that are available with the rules, and you end up feeling like the failure. And it did take me a long time to think, hang on, am I the problem, or is it actually just impossible? And the more I talked to people and realised my experience was not unique, that I took a lot of comfort from that. There were lots of us in the same boat. So that was the kind of turning point for me. But I think even before then, I'd probably been starting to question some of this stuff. But that was the point. And, you know, you're exhausted, so that your tether is shorter. So I think all of those things combined just meant I'd had enough. And I decided to jump ship with nothing to go to. It was just, I'd had enough. And I thought, I'm just going to go for it.
Quite serious then.
Yeah, yeah. It was the sense of life's too short, isn't it? And I think breaking free of some of those, you know, security blanket of steady income and not having to worry, it just tipped too far in the balance of not adding up. So I just went for it, and it's been fine. So thankfully, it's all worked out. I think these things often do. I think taking the plunge often works out for the best if it's just not kind of adding up for you anymore. So then I had a little bit of time to kind of regroup, and I met up with a colleague who I'd worked with way back, early doors in my career, at the company with the little silver trolley and the tea.
It was either you or her who had to pour the tea each time in the meeting, right?
Exactly. Hers was better. She did a better job of it, I have to say. So we had this, it was like dating. We had it over a coffee, and it was like sussing each other out. Both had kind of bad experiences with the rules of work. And we did almost like a red lines list, like stuff that if we're going to do something together, these are my red lines. And she wrote down hers. And we were really serious that if they didn't match, then it was just a no-go. There were some fundamentals. And we kind of compared lists, and they weren't the same, but we both agreed with all of the things that were on the other person's list. So for me, it was stuff like, I might want to have another child, and I want to be really open about that. And I don't want that to be a barrier, or for work to be a barrier towards that. There were about 10 things in total. When we realised we'd done the due diligence and we felt like we were aligned, we then just started in a small way. I mean, it's quite easy. All we needed was ourselves and our laptops. So in the beginning, you know, building this thing, it's quite exciting. There was nothing to lose, because we said if it doesn't work, we'll go and get a job. But we wanted to make sure we were building a company that all the stuff we'd always been told in our careers that we'd breathed in, we wanted to test whether that was true and chuck some of it out of the window. So the stuff that people would say, like, you have to work for the horrible clients, the ones who are either they're literally mean or they are doing bad stuff in the world. You have to work for them because they pay, and that allows you to do the work for the clients that you actually want to work with and that you like. That's the kind of payoff. So we wanted to test that out and see if that was true. And then we wanted to build a company where it's designed around having flex at the heart. So it is set up as a place where anyone with caring responsibilities, but also anyone who wants a life as well as work, can sort of...
A what?
A life. They can thrive and flourish without kind of judgment. So that's where we started, just to kind of test and learn and chuck stuff out the window. Rules can be great. Rules can be really, really useful. But I think just accepting all the rules without questioning is not a good thing.
And here you are 5 years later, a success story, which is great. So let's talk about first your approach to radical flexibility, as I think you call it, and this nonsense about all jobs are part-time by default. Tell us about that one.
So we offer all jobs part-time as standard, and you can work full-time, and people do work full-time in our team. About half of them do, but you have to ask. Do you have to make a request just to sort of flip that norm on its head and sort of point out the rule that has become such a part of society that we don't even notice it's there. We like to kind of flip things on their head. And within that, if you want to work full-time, how much you want to or are able to commit is up to you. So we'd have a discussion about it and shape the job accordingly. And people are always really astounded. How can you actually make that work, and how do you make the work fit? But my counterpoint to them, and just as proof of how much we've all breathed in the microplastics, isn't it actually more weird that all jobs fit into 37 and a half hours? Who made up that? That's bonkers.
Whether you're a neurosurgeon or a comms executive or a mechanic. Yeah, right, yeah.
So I think it's different, but it's no more or less mad than any of the other rules that we see as normal. And it works for us. So we just sort of piece it together, and we've carved out a bit of a niche with people wanting to work for us who are parents or who have caring responsibilities. And it's meant we've got really amazing people working for us, and they're very committed because there just aren't these kind of roles out there so often. So I know it sounds radical, but actually that's my constant challenge. Is it radical, or have we just breathed in the microplastics?
I love it. Yeah, I think that's what being a little bit radical is all about. And I'm imagining that the type of people that are attracted to your business have quite a lot of inbuilt creativity and are relatively free thinking because this appeals to them, I would guess. Do you think that you have attracted talent that you wouldn't have got if you were a more traditional agency ultimately?
100% we've attracted talent that we wouldn't have otherwise been able to get. I think it's, whenever I read on companies' websites that they've got the very best talent, but then I also read that they expect people to be in central London by 8:30 every morning. I'm like, isn't it weird that there's a Venn diagram that just the very best talent in the whole of the UK just also happens to overlap with the same people who can be in central London for 8:30 every weekday? Again, that cannot be true. So by broadening, you just do attract more talent, really, really good talent, and talent that's ignored by a lot of other organisations. So we're very lucky that we've got a brilliant and very committed team, because, you know, there just aren't loads of these jobs that are kind of creative and part-time out there.
Yeah, absolutely. I just saw the CEO of Channel 4 posting on LinkedIn, actually. She'd recorded a video asking more senior people to have some empathy. This was specifically for their younger employees. And, you know, this kind of stigma against them of like, oh, they're not committed because they don't want to come into London, you know, every day. Her point was as much around the finances of it, just the pure finances of it, that, you know, if you're a grad, your average salary is £28,000 now. Your rent in London is at least £1,000. You know, travel is £16 a day if you're coming in from outer London. And I know this, like we go to London once a month, and I just sort of turn up and I've spent 50 quid, like, so I can imagine that being new in your career, that's a real struggle, and that's just the kind of financial young people argument, let alone the kind of parents who've got to pick their kids up from nursery before 6 o'clock or they get fined, all of that stuff.
Yeah, the fines and the guilt. Yeah, totally. It's not just about any one type of person. Parents spring to my mind because it's a very sort of relevant example for me, but it's not having rules that are unnecessary and a one rule for all just doesn't work. I think people often get stuck on flexible work being about working from home. That is an option if you're putting together a kind of flexible role. But there's loads of options, and kind of part-time could be one, job share could be another, the times, the places, having a mix of places that you work. I don't understand why CEOs or what they're afraid of in kind of allowing flexibility. We try to be as stretchy as is humanly possible, and it's working, and it means that work works for more people.
Are there any other policies that you have, either that you're proud of or you think that a more traditional company would look at and go, that's crazy, how can you possibly have that policy?
So we have introduced salary transparency, not as far, I wanted to be more radical on this, but we find talking about money in this country quite hard, I think. You know how you said earlier you hadn't shared your salary? Of course I hadn't shared mine. Well, why? I think we don't like talking about money stuff. There's a lot of baggage attached to it, isn't there? And in some other places, there isn't that baggage. So, but anyway, we are moving, we're on a journey, and behaviour change is what we do for a living. And it's really important, you can't force people to do things if they're not comfortable. The rest of the kind of environment has to be right so people feel comfortable. So what we've done at the moment is made our salary bands available. And also we advertise every single role with a salary on it so that, you can quite easily compare and contrast. And I think when companies don't put a salary on a job description, it's silly for loads of reasons. But I think it does help build that secrecy in. It kind of bakes in the inequality because you can't easily compare and contrast what they're taking a new role out at your level to the market and potentially being willing to pay more. So that's definitely one that we do that gets discussed quite a lot. The other one's the triple bottom line, like having a business that success is measured on. Nothing wrong with profit. Profit's great, it's brilliant, but not at the expense of people and planet, and actually building your whole business plan around those three pillars and valuing them evenly. When people meet you at networking events and stuff and they say how's business, they mean how's the bottom line, like how's the money side, how's your profit. And actually I think we should be measuring the success of businesses on more than just profit.
Absolutely. That leads us on to the actual work now. It's all very well having all this flexibility, but what work are you doing at Jack and Grace? In particular, when we first met, you told me about a campaign that you were proud of called Plant Your Pants. So I think that sounds like a good one to start with.
Yeah, I love that campaign so much. It's actually the second time in my career I've got children digging for worms in mud. But the first time was with Riverford, and then this time with a really lovely charity called the Country Trust. And did you know, Rob, that burying a pair of cotton pants can be a really good way to test the health of soil? I suggest you grab a pair. Grab them now. I mean, it's a great experiment for children and getting children excited about nature and soil and science, because pants are hilarious and you kind of do it in groups and bury them, it's wild. But actually, when you dig those pants back up, the amount that they've been eaten away is a really good measure of soil health. So if there's nothing left, your soil is amazing. It's doing its job. There's lots of microbes in it. And if there's a lot of pants left, then you might need to think about what you're doing to your soil and how you could improve the health of it. So it was a lovely...
How interesting. Yeah. I hope there's going to be just hundreds more pairs of pants buried.
I hope so.
After listening to this.
It was on the Archers. Are you an Archers fan?
I can't say I am. No,
You're
to be
you are
honest.
missing out. I love the Archers, but yeah, Burying Pants made it onto the Archers. But it is a really good tool to kind of get children excited about nature. And one of my very favourite bits of work was on that campaign.
That's awesome. And you've talked a bit about one of your red lines early on was challenging the idea that you have to work for the rich, evil people to pay for the poor, nice people. But you've managed to build a business where it seems like you only work with organizations that share your values. So talk to us about that. And that must come with some challenges, right? From when people inquire, how do you kind of evaluate opportunities when they come in?
Yeah, we do. It's not easy. I mean, I always think any way of running a business isn't easy. So you may as well do it for good. But it is hard to figure out who the right clients are. We've got a bit of a framework that we use. We've had to put some science to it because in the very beginning, we were just going on gut instinct. And do you know what? That probably worked about right, but we wanted to put some more structure to it. And partly because we were cowards. And when you're saying no to people, it's really hard if you're just like, oh, I just got this feeling. So now we're able to say, look, I'm really sorry, but we've run it through our framework and it just doesn't fit. And we're very set on kind of who we work with and the work that we do. So we always say that clients choose us, but we also choose them. And we've committed to making sure 70% of our income comes from, we've got quadrants. It's quite a complicated system, lots of questions. And then you plot the client or potential client out on a grid and they end up in one quadrant. And if you're in quadrant 1, great, happy days. If you're in quadrant 2.
And what is that? What is quadrant 1? Is that like good for the planet?
Yeah, good for
people or something?
Good for people, good for the planet. But the key difference between quadrant 1 and quadrant 2 is demonstrable impact. So quadrant 1, you've got the track record in place. And we allow a little bit of scope within our target to work with some clients who they kind of meet what we're looking for in terms of potential impact for people and for planet. But perhaps they're a startup or perhaps they haven't got the sort of track record in place yet. So we've got a little bit of room. And then for other people, other organizations that fit into quadrant 3 and 4, it's a no-go for different reasons. But we're really strict on it. And we've had some really nice briefs come in where the actual piece of work is for something really good. Maybe it's around, employee engagement or something really positive. But actually, when you look at the parent company that wants it, they're not making a positive difference in the world. And everybody does it differently and no judgment because we're all sort of finding our way with it. But that's how we've decided to do it. I think because we were really trying to test out this theory that we'd always been told is not possible. So we've really stuck to our guns on that. And we're not the only ones doing that, but we are quite strict on it.
No, really interesting. It sounds like a good methodology. So the way we do it is we use B Corp's disclosure areas. I think last time I checked, there was sort of 14 industries. And if they're in that industry, they kind of get flagged and then we review it as a leadership team about whether we think that the project is right and making a positive impact, like you say. So it sounds like we're a bit more lenient than you, but I think it's important to have some sort of process, for this if you're trying to evaluate potential clients and that they align with your values.
I think the B Corp is a good one to follow. Have you seen recently there's been a bit of people kind of leaving the certification?
Yes,
and
I have seen that. What do you think about that?
I think any tool like B Corp, any sort of measure is what you make it. You can go in for the wrong reasons, can't you, and look for a tick box, or you can go in wholeheartedly and use that framework to drive for better. And as a certification body, you set your rules, and yes, there'll be some people who come in and do the bare minimum, but I think it's a really useful tool. We found it useful to sort of formalize and put proper structure and measurement. It's really pushed us to get that evidence base into position. I think it's useful. I think it's good.
That seems to be the summary of the criticism to me, is that specifically on environment and climate, they feel it's not strong enough. And then the other piece was around that there's large corporations that are not all good that are getting B Corp certification. I tend to lean on the side of the more businesses we can get up to a minimum standard, the better, rather than a small number, then it's staying a small group of very, very niche companies that achieve the highest possible standards of everything. I don't feel that's going to create as much impact. At the B Corp Festival last year in Oxford, there was a lady there who referred to us as being a bunch of beach cleaners.
Wow. Was that complimentary or not? I can't tell.
Well, I think it was both, but I think it was a great analogy of the impact, because, the movement is still a niche group of businesses, mostly small businesses like ours, and we're doing the right thing and we're going out there and doing a lovely job, but a load of trash is going to be dumped on that beach again, the next day. So, yeah, I think the broadening of the impact of B Corp is a must, really. And I think the only way you do that is by getting some or all of the standards adopted by more businesses and different types of businesses and bigger businesses.
Yep. And you drive improvement from there.
Yes.
Yep.
So, Nyree, sadly, we must come to the last section of our podcast, what is a little bit radical world appropriate, given that we were just talking about beach cleaning. But what's a little bit radical change for the world that you would like to see people get behind?
You will fall off your chair at this, but my radical change would be more flexible working. As I bang on and on and on about it, I think if there was one big change, more flexible working, and it wouldn't all look the same. It would be different in different sectors. But my husband works in policing, and through a series of many years of lobbying on my part, we have managed to build in more flexibility, even in his role. I believe it is possible in any sector. That would be my big change, more flex.
I think policing, what a great example of a job role that people would think, it's all very well for us in our creative digital agencies to say work from home and everything, but some people have to turn up and be police officers. So what did that look like for him and for his force?
He has gone part-time, and I was lobbying him because he just...
I see, yeah.
It wasn't what, it isn't what men typically do, even now in policing. Certainly there is much more of it amongst women, especially when they've had a child. You might come back part-time, but it's just not the done thing. But so the lobbying was very much me. I won't give you too much insight into the depths of the kind of marital discussions that went on.
Your marriage.
But you can imagine. We got there, and it honestly has changed our lives for the better. It's been so revolutionary, and he loves it. And there was no pushback within the force. Like, there's been the odd comment from colleagues, but in terms of the people who were making the decisions and the structures, it works brilliantly. So yeah, I firmly believe it's possible.
You saying that, I kind of think that surely those kind of jobs that can be potentially very high stress are a perfect candidate to suggest part-time working, because you get more recovery time and then you're kind of back at your best. Fantastic. Well, sadly, we've come to the end of our time together, Nyree. It's been lovely to speak to you. The last question is always the same, which is, if there's someone listening out there who has a little bit of a radical idea for a business or for their personal life, or maybe something that goes between the two, like they need to lobby their partner to go and work part-time at their job, but they don't know where to get started, what would your advice be to that person?
I think you can think about this stuff for too long, and I certainly did. My advice, based on my experience, would be to take both of your feet and just jump into it, and everything else will follow and kind of fall into place around it. So I think you can spend too long on the theory of it and agonizing about it. And if my journey so far has taught me anything, it's just go for it, and everything else will settle into place around it, which I think that feels like quite a common thing that your guests say, like, just go for it. But I do really, really think life's too short to be miserable. And if you feel like you're failing to keep up with the rules, it will be the rules, not you.
Really good. And yes, you're right. It's a very common answer from our guests. Just get started. Well, Nyree, thank you so much for joining us today. Really great chatting to you, and I hope to speak to you again soon.
Thank you for listening to this podcast. If you enjoyed it, please follow us on your podcast platform. If you'd like to appear on A Little Bit Radical, or have an idea of someone we should speak to, please email podcast@standingongiants.com or get in touch with me on LinkedIn. You can search Rob Fawkes or search Standing on Giants and you'll find me there. Thank you very much and speak to you next time.